A very good morning to everyone, and welcome to day 3 of CyFy. It's indeed a privilege and honor for me to be chairing this panel discussion on a very, very significant topic, which is the future of the Tech Accord. And I'm even more delighted that we have such an amazing set of panelists, exactly the kind of stakeholders we need for this discussion. So a very relevant panel with the right set of people to deep dive into what the future of the Tech Accord should be. But before we get started, let me familiarize the audience a little with what exactly is the Tech Accord and how did it come to be. With the proliferation of the digital economy, what we're also seeing is an exponential rise in cybercrime. And I think that's led technology companies around the world to think about some bold new initiatives to defend an open, free, and secure internet. And in April this year, some of the biggest names in the technology space decided to come together and sign the Cybersecurity Tech Accord. So there were 34 companies that decided to do that, which was essentially nothing but getting everyone on the table, getting them united on a set of principles that would advance cooperation in cybersecurity. So what are some of those principles? Why is this such a significant move? And what is the future for cybersecurity in the post-Cybersecurity Tech Accord world? Those are some of the questions we're going to hopefully answer in the next 1 hour. But let's dive straight into the discussion. And let me actually invite Kaja from Microsoft to set the context for us. Microsoft, in fact, has been the leader in the Cybersecurity Tech Accord and has brought some of the largest companies together. Kaja, explain to us why you believe this is, in some ways, an inflection point for the global digital economy.
Yeah, it was. Hi, good morning, everyone. So thank you. I think you summarized it well. Basically, we at Microsoft have been looking at the global landscape, both in terms of cybercrime, but also the landscape of government offensive operations in cyberspace with the level of concern over the past few years. And we realized that to make sure that we move the debate forward, we needed to not only sort of keep calling on others to do more, but ensure that the industry sort of steps up and sort of makes the first steps to communicate and do more to increase cybersecurity online. With that in mind, we pulled together initially the group of the 34 companies, which is now grown to 61 companies. So there's a lot of momentum behind it, which is exciting. I think we get new applications almost every day around this Cybersecurity Tech Accord. On purpose, a fairly high level and simple set of principles. Like you said, there were 4 principles. They are, the first one is calling on all signatories to the Tech Accord to not cooperate with anyone else on cyber offense. So to make sure that you are investing in defenses and ensuring that you are not going out and further destabilizing the cyberspace. The second is really focused on protecting your customers, users, so focus on defense. And then the third and the fourth one, like you alluded to, really focused on empowering others, right, both in terms of ensuring that you can increase their capability to act more prudently in cyberspace, and whether you're thinking, and with that we have in mind both sort of consumers, but also developers. So figuring out ways to support their ability to do more in cyber. And then the last one focuses on collaboration amongst the tech companies to increase the level of security all up.
Perfect. So that's a great summary of the principles of the Tech Accord. But Arun, let's take that forward and build on why we believe this is path-breaking. Path-breaking not just for the tech companies, but perhaps in an age when we're seeing the kind of techlash that we are, at a time when there is a pressing need for companies to step up their game.
Thanks, Shweta. And I think it is a big moment, given the names that started out on the roster of the Cybersecurity Tech Accords and the names that have since been added are both giants in this field. So they have the market heft to pull something of this scale and sophistication off. The question really is, as you said, whether governments will follow through in some way, either by embracing the Tech Accords themselves or adopting those principles in the Tech Accord in some form or the other. And I think what I appreciate about the fact that companies like Microsoft are pushing for is they're very clear in that there has to be a framework of rules. And that is the language that governments best appreciate. But so let me open by offering a strategy that the Tech Accords should now pursue, given that there are 70-odd companies or 60-odd companies who have signed up. And I think the Accords themselves are now subject to the law of diminishing marginal returns. The cost of adding every company is greater than the benefit that it will now give, because most of the companies, as I said, are already in the roster. It is perhaps time now for the companies who are involved, who are the architects of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, to get individual government agencies on board. I know this is perhaps a little counterintuitive and goes against the whole of government approach, but I think it's perhaps time that the Cybersecurity Tech Accord speaks to, say, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, or the Unique Identification Authority of India, the Cyberspace Administration in China, the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. Go to individual agencies within government and then tell them, you don't have to sign up to anything, given that that will probably require the clearance from the foreign ministries of the respective governments, but come on board as mentors that you necessarily need not sign up to, but would, support or endorse in forums like this. That would essentially provide the next level of momentum that is required for the Cybersecurity Tech Accords. Because, and wearing the hat of an international lawyer, there are three ingredients that have always come together, a constellation of factors that have come together for the most successful treaties in the world. That is a major private sector actor, a major government, and a moment that the private sector and the government have both seized on. If you look at, for instance, the law of the sea. When Hugo Grotius, who is recognized as the father of international law, wrote the principles that formed the modern, principles of the law of the sea, he was essentially a lawyer for the Dutch East India Company. He was holding their brief. But the fact is that the Dutch government or the Dutch monarchy at that time was very interested in allowing rules of commerce on the oceans that enabled Dutch companies and also Western European companies to go forth and promote the colonial enterprise and so on and so forth. So Hugo Grotius' activity of creating these draft rules of the sea essentially gained momentum because it had a private actor and it had a government actor, and there was a moment, which was the colonial moment at that time, that enabled this. When Henri Dunant, who created the ICRC, the modern Red Cross, he was able to create this sophisticated range of instruments and the ICRC backing as a custodian of the Geneva Conventions. He was able to do it because he had access as a very prominent Swiss banker to the Swiss Parliament, which was the epicenter of the negotiations of the ICRC. He had access to the French monarchy, and most importantly, Europe was war-weary at that time. There was the Battle of Solferino and so on that enabled Henri Dunant to harvest a certain moment in time where this negotiation and these accords were possible. If you look at modern day history and take the example of the Montreal Protocol, which is today recognized as the most successful international agreement in the history of the world, given its effort to tackle the depletion of the ozone layer. You needed the United States to sign on to the Montreal Protocol. You needed a major private company, which is DuPont, which resisted for the longest time rules to prevent ozone depleting emissions, and you needed a moment. The moment was a point of time when Americans and a lot of countries in a lot of advanced economies were worried about the rates of skin cancer. That was the moment that both governments and private actors catalyzed. for the private actor, DuPont, which resisted initially, there was a breakthrough in R&D which allowed for them to create substances that were alternative to ozone-depleting substances. And it was then easy for the US government to capitalize on this, warning of high rates of skin cancer. And so unless these three ingredients come together, it is difficult. And I think this is something that the companies who are involved in the Cybersecurity Tech Accord should keep in mind.
Right, that's an interesting historical context, and it also in some ways explains why it's critical for some of these accords, coalitions to be successful. But Gail, if I could first come to you before we move on to discussing what would the future look like, what would success mean, to first understand the need, the reasons, the compulsions why companies like Facebook decided to come together with their peers in the tech space, sit across the table and agree on a set of principles. What were some of the compelling reasons that led to this path-breaking moment?
So I think for Facebook, there was a push and a pull factor. The pull factor was that for us, this is our everyday. So at the time that we were starting to discuss the tech accord with Microsoft and with the other companies was at the time that there was a very active debate, which is obviously still ongoing, about the misuse of the Facebook platform to interfere in elections. So for us, cybersecurity had become not just, I mean, it never is like a theoretical debate for us in the company, but it had become a really active one, and one that we are still engaging with our users and policymakers on an everyday basis. So we were looking at not only cybersecurity starting to mean attacks on our systems, and we again saw that last week with people regularly trying to gain access to Facebook and the data that we hold. So the misuse, we were seeing attacks on our systems. We were also seeing attempts to obtain data that we hold, and we were seeing the misuse of our platform and the misuse of technology to undermine democracies. So that at the time meant that we really felt that we had a huge responsibility to take a leadership role in this space and to try and define together with the other companies what good looked like. And as Kaja very clearly outlined, good is for us are in those 4 principles, and we can go into them in more detail later. So that was, I think, the pull factor. The push factor was just as we understood that we needed to show leadership, we also knew that there was a big issue about building trust, and building trust not just with our users but with governments. And this was a very clear way of signaling that these were principles that we were going to live up to in our everyday activity. So this, for us, this is in no way, and I know we'll get onto it later, a sort of theoretical debate about let's have principles that are written and don't mean anything to how the company operates on an everyday basis. These are things that these are principles that we want to live by and start to develop to becoming international norms in the way that we first intended when we were discussing them.
Ephraim, if I could get your opening remarks on why you believe this is significant, not just for tech companies and governments, but for the individual user, for the entire movement on human rights, for civil society, and why this is, you believe, path-breaking, if at all.
Okay, so my name is Ephraim. Regarding the Tech Accord and protecting the users, this is the first big step where companies working closely. The 4 principles where, if you look, for example, on principle number 4, saying that empowering the users, working with others, this is a big first step, and it's welcome to go in this direction. And just maybe also just to build on what Arun mentioned about getting more endorsement, more people getting on board on this beyond the 61 companies that have already signed this. There's 2 other companies beyond Europe and the US which sell tech maybe to my part of the world. So this is maybe just to build also on Gail's comment, maybe looking forward a bit on that. But then this is a big first step, and maybe just to link it to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. This is maybe compliance in a way, but there's need to do more, which I'll be happy to talk about later.
The need to do more, and that's exactly what I think we need to now discuss. And again, Kaja, if I could come back to you. Let's first immediately try to understand what would success look like when we talk about the Tech Accord. Of course, we've made a great beginning. From 34, the number of signatories have increased to 61 from April till now. Companies like Salesforce are now signatories. We have a number of like the who's who in the tech space who are signatories to the Tech Accord. So that's one way of perhaps measuring success, right? You've got the right players in the room. You've got the numbers swelling. But what else would define success? Would it be sharing of vulnerabilities? Would it be governments embracing the accord? Would it be companies now agreeing to walk the talk in many ways? How would you define success, say, 1 year down the line?
So I would probably say that the last one, right? I think the companies walking the talk. I think there is already a level of so when we talk with governments, I think they're generally have reacted very positively to it. I think together with the sort of Siemens Charter of Trust, which is a similar initiative but focused slightly less on the pure tech sector and more on the, I would say, critical infrastructure type players. I think the two initiatives have been sort of called out several times by, I think, regulators in Europe in particular as sort of examples of good practice. But I think the last one, the companies walking the walk, I think is the one we'd like to see most progress on. I think we've grown, like you said, over the past few months, but I think that we've also started to see some initiatives put in place. I think the ones that I think are going to be most impactful in the short run probably are the ones sort of that are focused on sort of capacity building. So, for example, we announced together with the Global Forum for Cybersecurity Expertise, the GFCE, that the Tech Accord will run a series of webinars on capacity building sort of every month for emerging economies. So each company will participate and sort of share some of the best practices in security. Another example is the work around, we called for a broader adoption of coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies, CVDs, and sort of put up the ones that the Tech Accord companies at the moment have on our site. Since we've done that, there's been more, at least even within the group, there's been more companies that have developed their own. So it's a helpful step forward to reducing vulnerabilities in the system. And sort of there were a couple of other ones. I think we endorsed a civil society initiative that's called Manners, the mutually agreed norms for routing security. We're also, the idea behind it is to reduce the level of bad traffic online. And the initiative before was really driven by the telcos and sort of having cloud providers in particular, but other tech companies sort of start engage in that effort. It has started to shape the initiative more and sort of allow it to expand and have greater impact. So we're really looking for both companies be really supporting the principles they signed, but also taking active step towards reducing security issues out there.
Right, Gail, if I could step back a little and once again set the context of why this is significant. This is coming at a time when there is an increased pressure on companies to take a principled approach. We're living in a world of techlash. We're living in a world where there is a strained relationship between tech companies and governments, between tech companies and civil society. And that's why it is perhaps the need of the hour that companies send a strong message around their principles, around their values, because many would believe that if we don't see self-regulation or self-realization of principles and values by tech companies, we're going to see either a backlash or some form of regulation that companies may not always appreciate. Explain to us, especially in the context of a post-Cambridge Analytica world, so to say, and the kind of backlash that Facebook has faced, why the messaging on this one is in itself a measure of success?
I think that's a great question. And if we look at last week's hack on our systems, so I'm sure you, given we're a cybersecurity conference and you're all cybersecurity experts, you were following this, maybe not as closely as I was, but certainly pretty closely. So last week, starting on the 16th of September, we discovered some unusual activity in our system, and on the 25th, we identified that there had been a use of a combination of 3 vulnerabilities that had enabled bad actors to gain access to access tokens on users' accounts, and that affected tens of millions of users around the world. But if we look at the principles that the Tech Accord had given us, how did we use those to try and help us respond, to try and make sure, as you say, in a post-Cambridge Analytica world, that we were able to build trust, start rebuilding and build trust both with users and with governments. Well, I think that the first principles are about protecting users everywhere. So the first thing that we did, and we perhaps came out quicker than people expected us to, was to identify that we had this attack and to tell users that we had done that, and that we were taking action, and that we locked them out of their accounts and we asked them to log back in again. So the first principle, protecting users everywhere. We also locked down part of our system, including the view as, to make sure that we could follow the second principle of opposing attacks from anywhere, to make sure that we could really, as Kaja and you have said, sort of walk the walk and show that we were taking action against attacks that we were facing. Thirdly, the principle about empowering users, our customers and developers, to make sure that we understood that we could help them take action against what we were facing. So we pointed people to the tools that we've got to help them protect their own security, and this was another opportunity for us to remind our users that there are a number of tools that Facebook provides, including 2-factor authentication, changing their privacy settings to make sure that they can keep their accounts as secure as others. And then maybe most importantly, when it comes to building trust with governments, is the fourth part about partnering with others. So we informed governments, including government agencies, including the Mighty here, about what had happened and the action that we were taking. And I think if we look at the Tech Accord, it very much gives us a tool to engage with governments, and it gives us principles to talk about with the government, and it means that we can talk not just about the theory, but about the standards that we're trying to hold ourselves to. And I think that in itself is very useful and means that we can have a conversation that is perhaps more granular and more principled, to your post-Cambridge Analytica point, than we might have had 2 years ago.
Right, Arun, and that brings me to the point of being proactive in the approach of both having a strong moral compass, being more principled, having a strong set of values, and at the same time, the messaging around it. I think the one important thing that's happened with this Tech Accord is sending a signal that Silicon Valley is differentiating or creating that distinction between itself and government cyber warfare in some ways. And success for the Accord would also mean governments embracing it. How do you think the response of governments has been so far? And do you think that's a critical piece of success, whether or not governments embrace it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think anything that remotely resembles the set of principles that these companies have come up with can be successfully implemented without the help of governments. And it's really, you've said that the lines have been drawn on the sand, that there are Silicon Valley companies that say, look, this is not, for instance, Google has said, which is not a party to the Accord, but it has said that we will not be engaging in, our engineers won't be involved in developing technology for the Pentagon and so forth. But the fact is that under the Obama administration, for instance, there was something called the DIUX, the Defense Innovation Unit X, that was set up in Silicon Valley that meant that there would be a direct line between DoD in the United States and Silicon Valley. So there are companies, you know, you don't have to take names, there are companies that are invested in technologies that essentially have a military effect. So the challenge for those companies that have come together to create the Cybersecurity Accord is to create this consensus first within Silicon Valley. You know, does everybody agree with the stand that Google has taken? Or are there folks who are still invested in, and there will always be, invested in creating technologies that are intended for military use? And you asked, for instance, what can companies do more? One of the things that can be done, companies can do more vis-a-vis the Cybersecurity Accord by doing less. There are so many conversations that I've heard in the last 2 days where people are talking about hackbacks and active defenses. One of the principles in the Cybersecurity Tech Accord is that companies will not develop offensive capabilities. I'm paraphrasing, but that's one of the principles in the Tech Accords. The number of conversations that we've had at CyFy, for instance, on hackbacks and active defenses, it sends a very dangerous signal that some companies are willing to take these proactive offensive measures that have a destabilizing effect. And if you will indulge me, the name Accord, I like the term because it reminds me of the Sokovia Accords. And if you have seen the 300 Marvel movies that have come out in recent years, you will realize that the Sokovia Accords are essentially this agreement between the Avengers and the United Nations, where the Avengers decide to give up their power to the UN. There is this scene where Black Widow goes to Captain America and says, do not hunt the Winter Soldier down, because that is now the job of the UN. And for better or for worse, Captain America does not agree to that prescription. What you need if you have a cybersecurity accord is for private companies to say, look, we've developed this set of principles, but now this is a job for governments, and we will do less, and that is how you can do more.
Right, do less, and that's how you do more. Kaja, quickly to Arun's point, do we see this accord turning into a treaty? Is that something that would be an ideal way forward? Or do we see some form of more explicit embracement by way of governments? Like, what do you think should be the next step?
So I think it actually probably is largely for the signatories themselves to decide, right? I think it's not, you know, from a Microsoft perspective, I would say there is definitely benefits to what Arun was outlining, and I think there is definitely a need in terms of, you know, like what he was pointing out is correct, right? You have on the one side the industry that sort of pledges a certain set of behaviors, but you do need to have on the other side sort of the government counterpart to pledge a similar set of behaviors. Right. I think, I'm not sure it would turn into a treaty per se, but I think there is a path forward and a start for a discussion, sure, rather than anything else. But largely, I think that's sort of probably a Microsoft view and not necessarily reflecting all the membership.
Sure. Ephraim, when we talk about digital peace at a time when there is increased incidence of cybercrime, there is cyber warfare by governments, what, according to you, should be done to ensure that we are protecting individual rights? Would you go in for more legislative interventions? Would you rather have self-regulation by tech companies and more principles being put in place? Or do you think that we have to allow things to just pan out and it will sort out by itself?
Yeah, so regarding digital peace and to ensure that there is protection of users, the issue of attribution, which Kaja and Gail maybe have talked about before, it would be ideal for it to be opened up to more academics to be involved beyond just a company giving attribution and saying this government has done this, or this researchers from this part of the world have done that before. So maybe that would make it more protecting for users, because some governments might retaliate thinking it's that, and maybe in using, for example, let me go to the IHL, international human rights, so international humanitarian law principles, whereby you're not supposed to, civilians are not supposed to be part of warfare. So it's maybe less regulation, but more principles in a way, whereby if these principles, just to go back to my first statement, if these principles are embraced beyond Silicon Valley and Europe to Nairobi, where companies are coming up, to Shenzhen, in China and the other town. All this, if it's more global, I think it's the first better step before thinking of like of legislation, because these dangers of legislation, sometimes legislation in my part of the world brings issues of content such as fake news and other things, which are not protecting the infrastructure but protecting politicians against criticism. So I would be less focused on legislation but more on principles, and this is a good first step, just that we need to globalize it. And on the issue of attribution, just to emphasize that there is need for a multi-stakeholder way of dealing with attribution, beyond just companies or governments doing that, and just also the globalization bit. So those are my main points, making these efforts more global, beyond just Silicon Valley and the US companies, to more other companies coming up in the rest of the world, and India and other parts of the world.
Sure, I think Kaja has a point to make.
Yeah, no, I would just say, I think we probably have only half the companies that our signatures are, at the moment, are American. Right. So I would say, you know, there's a fair amount of European companies, and also they're not just large players. And I think that's kind of the bit that is, it's interesting about the Tech Accord, because while I think initially there was a large group of effectively mostly US companies, it resonated with a much broader audience. So whether they were security vendors, whether chip manufacturers, whether cloud providers, and irrespective of size and irrespective where they're from, or where they're originally from, I would say, I think it brought together a group of people who felt the need to make sure the internet's protected. I think there's definitely more to be done, right? I think we'd love to have more participation, in particular, I think, from Middle East and Africa and South America. I think India as well. I think Asia sort of going up the list a little bit. Like we had Hitachi, Panasonic, Atlassian, I feel, joined recently. But there's room to grow. But I would just point out that there is actually fairly global representation.
And if I can just add, that was something we were really conscious of at the start, was making sure that this wasn't another big American companies deciding what global values should be, and that we consciously tried to make sure in the first tranche of companies that it was as international as possible. But at the same time, because we did want this, and we do want these to be principles that we live by and work by, we didn't want to just accept any company, and especially ones that within our own discussion we felt were maybe doing the opposite of what the principles suggest. We didn't want this to be a rubber stamp that then companies could use as a sort of get out of jail free card.
And I think one way in which the world is watching whether this is a mere rubber stamp, or many critics would even say perhaps a marketing ploy or a PR exercise by tech companies, or a way of cleaning up their act in some ways. So that's obviously the critics' view. But I think one way in which the Accord is moving forward with real action is some of the steps that have been taken, some getting everybody on the table to agree on certain things. And Kaja, if you could specifically talk about the kind of plea that has been made around the WHOIS database, and what is it that the Accord is really suggesting on that front, and how do you think that amounts to greater cybersecurity?
Sure. So I think that was probably, I think, the first, maybe the second initiative that the group sort of agreed to take on, and it was sort of early in the summer. And but effectively, it's a call on ICANN to as soon as possible put a system in place where access to particular sets of data that helps security defenders basically track down criminals. It sort of remains or is restarted begins to be accessible again. Effectively after GDPR, I think and rightly, there was a level of sort of assessment at ICANN in terms of what can you do in terms of ensuring that you're compliant, but also ensuring that you can still use the data for security. But there's been a significant delay in terms of getting the process in place.
Sure.
So that was the call. Really was a call to with a set of suggestions on how to make sure that you can still defend online.
Right, Arun. Going forward, I think the critical bit will be tech companies ensuring users and customers that there is no trust deficit. Holding trust is the number one value. At Salesforce, for instance, we always talk about trust being the highest value, but there is an increasing need for tech companies to send out those reassurances, to tell the world that yes, they are doing enough and more on the issue of trust. Some would say whatever is happening now is too little, too late. At the same time, what's also a concerning trend that while you're seeing the membership of the Accord swell, and as Kaja said, you're getting applications by the day, there are some big names that are missing still. Wouldn't that send a not so good signal? Because this would seem like low-hanging fruit in today's times.
I think that's we should, I think, Shweta, we should also put the moment in context. The number of CEOs from Silicon Valley who are lining up to testify before the US Congress is essentially, I mean, we do talk about states reasserting themselves in cyberspace, but is that relationship between the state and the major tech company shared in jurisdictions like India and China? I don't think so. Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey is being made to testify in US Congress for as you said, breaching the trust of the user, or for having to do more to regain the trust of the user. But in jurisdictions like China and India, there is a ever more greater collaboration between the private tech companies and the government. The UN Secretary General, for instance, has set up this high-level panel with Jack Ma as the co-chair of that particular grouping, and the grouping is expected to provide some norms around the digital economy, which will presumably supplement the Tech Accord. Now, it's inconceivable that the Secretary General would have gotten Jack Ma to co-chair the panel had it not been for the fact that he also has established ties to the Communist Party. I think it's a good development. Jack Ma brings with him a certain political agency that few other entrepreneurs are able to do. The Secretary General's right-hand man, Fabrizio Hochschild, recently said that he is very clear, the Secretary General is very clear that the next GGE should be multi-stakeholder. This is an astonishing statement. I think the US will be the first government to say that the UNGG should not be multi-stakeholder because it reduces the power of the Security Council. So there are things happening. When the Indian government announced demonetization in November 2016, on the next day of the announcement, there was a full-page advertisement taken by Paytm, hailing it as a great announcement for whatever the merits of that decision might be. The fact is that tech companies in parts of the world where the market is growing are very much hand in glove with the government. So then the areas of trust become quite blurred. I think it's quite clear when it comes to Facebook or Twitter, but it's really in other parts of the world where this trust deficit issue has not been addressed, and it's still clouded by a certain kind of politics.
And that's why, Gail, it'll be more important for large platforms, big tech companies that are increasingly growing, that are becoming more and more powerful, to send out clear messages around the power of their platform and how that is being used. And I think those are ongoing debates and discussions that are taking place within companies, perhaps companies like Facebook, where very often they did not see this coming, very often they did not realize the kind of backlash that would come through. But now is the time to go ahead and make those bold statements, to in some ways reset and rethink the future.
So I think that I think that's exactly right, and I think that there are sort of two things that we are actively thinking about, and especially actively thinking about in India. So the first thing is that this is a long game. This is not something that we can fix overnight, and particularly when we're looking at my area of safety and security, this is something that we will need to be working on and continuing to develop with our users and with other stakeholders over the next 10 years. We need to be developing products that are secure in the way that the users in India here, but also in our users around the world expect. And the second thing that we are, or second issue that we are actively thinking about is how do we ensure that we have a multi-stakeholder engagement that has that transparency that Arun's talking about, but actively shows that we are listening to the concerns of governments around the world on safety and security. Because just as it's an active debate in India, it's probably one of the biggest issues that we're hearing around, and people want to talk to us about, and governments want to talk to us about around the world. And I think we have to be seen to be at the table and seen to be having those discussions, but doing so in a way that doesn't look like it's behind closed doors, right. And isn't looking, as Arun was talking about, as if it's hand in glove and betraying the trust of our users, which at the end of the day, as we've all been saying, is the currency that we all have to deal in.
Right. I think I'm going to now throw open the discussion to the audience to ask a few questions. I would just have one request. If you could introduce yourself, be very specific in the question and let it be a question, not a comment, and if possible, direct it to a specific panelist. Go ahead. I think we have the first question there. Yeah.
Hi, John Mallory, MIT. So my question is, we have a lot of vulnerability in the system, something like $4.3 trillion a year worth of annual ICT sales.
John, we can't hear you.
No. Oh, we have a lot of vulnerability in the system, something like $4.3 trillion worth of annual ITC sales. There's various approaches you can use to improve information assurance in it, one of which is industry associations like you have. And so my question is, do you have a deliberation process in which you analyze kinds of vulnerabilities which are critical and then take action to retire those vulnerabilities? And if so, what does it look like? And does it have both a reactive and a proactive component? So obviously some emergency virus situation you respond to, but that proactive one can help you because this is an exponential process. And so if you're looking for vulnerability corrections or architectural corrections that can give you a multiplicative impact, you'll have more impact on this very large amount of IT. So that's my question.
Who would like to take that?
Kaja?
Yeah.
So no, we don't, and I think on purpose. We didn't want to create an operational organization that would be duplicative of some of the ones that are already out there. There's a lot of information sharing organizations that exist, in different parts of the world, but in different sectors as well. And so that's why we specifically didn't set it up as an operational exchange of vulnerabilities type of group.
But just to add to that, wouldn't that be critical to this? Because if there is no active sharing of vulnerabilities, whether it's between companies or governments and companies, don't you think moving forward on cybersecurity would be harder?
So what I was trying to say is there already is, and different fora that exist, and this is why we didn't want to create another one that would sort of do this sort of semi-well, right? Purposely, we felt that those type of mechanisms are already out there.
Sure. John, is that okay?
The follow-up, it's not really the tracking the vulnerability so much the issue, but retiring it. And since the vendors control the production chain, those are the ones that are able to make the fixes.
Yeah.
So, and they're going to prioritize what they do in one way or another. So you could have some criteria or plan or whatever to encourage the prioritization among your set of members.
So I think that's part of the vulnerability, coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies that we encourage groups to have. I think like we have one at Microsoft. I think Salesforce has one. Facebook also has one. And so I think that becomes more a question of, I think, individual processes, but we definitely agree that the company should have those things in place.
Okay, and thank you. We'll move on to the next question.
I was going to add one thing really, really quickly. For the first time, as various other panelists have pointed out, we have all of these companies having the conversation. So just getting those links together enables us to have some of the operational conversations that perhaps we weren't having before with other companies.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Ilona Sterling, Internet Governance Project, Georgia Tech. So on the webpage of the Tech Accord, the first sentence explicitly says that it is a public commitment of parties to this accord to adhere to the norms. But as I understand, it implies that it requires some kind of accountability and reporting what you have achieved so far in regarding to these commitments. And my question is this, whether the parties of the accord are supposed to issue some reports what they have done in order to achieve this commitment, or maybe that will be some kind of joint reports issued by the Tech Accord, like on a year basis or 2-year basis, something like this. Thank you.
Again.
So this is something that we actively discussed at the start, and I think we're not, how many months are we in now?
Probably
6 months, yeah. And I suspect we will be having that conversation again soon, because as we've said, this is definitely about showing that we're doing something, hence why there has been so much activity, and a lot of that credit goes to Kaja, who's driving a lot of it personally. But so I think you can probably expect some of that, and I also expect us as companies to be talking about what we're doing with respect to the Accord. Yeah.
Because it's really hard to check.
Yeah, well, it's all on the website, right? So if you go to the Cybersecurity Tech Accord.org or .com, both, you know, there's regular updates. They're probably, I think, now almost weekly. So just go on the website. So we are being super open about it.
Yeah.
All right, more questions. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, Wolfram von Einitz. I work for the German government, for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Just a question on the Facebook case. I don't really understand the connection to the Tech Accord. Isn't that simply a breach of laws? And isn't it just not by accident that the Data Commission in Ireland, acting on behalf of the European Union, is, according to my knowledge, the only one actually who questioned Facebook of what happened and what was actually breached. It wasn't satisfied with the saying, oh, we had a data breach and 50 million users are affected, but we don't know what happened. And that's because the European Union has probably the most advanced, or at least the newest, data protection regulation. And so where's the connection to the Tech Accord? Isn't that something where we need more regulation, actually, and we give authorities more power to follow up on a breach of law?
Okay, so I think that there are two different issues. There's what were we obliged to do because we're regulated, and we, in terms of legally having to respond, there were two agencies that we had to respond to. One, as you correctly indicated, were the Irish Data Protection Authority, because Facebook Ireland, which is the data controller for Europe, is regulated by the Irish Data Protection Authority. And the other one is the FTC in the US, because Facebook Inc. is regulated by the US. However, if we come back to the issue of trust, this is not just about what we're legally obliged to do. We also have, we believe, an obligation to ensure that we can continue to build on and maintain the trust of our users and governments around the world. And this is where the Tech Accord is relevant, because it's not just about doing what we are legally obliged to do. So I would respectfully disagree that some of the things that we did were just because of GDPR and the Irish Data Protection Authority. If we look at protecting the user, we went, it wasn't just European users that we alerted to the fact, we alerted users around the world. We also alerted governments around the world and regulators around the world about what had happened, because again, this isn't just about regulation, it's about building trust and transparency and showing exactly what we're doing. And I think that is where the Tech Accord is helping to drive some of the activity that we're doing.
All right, more questions? Yeah, please go ahead.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, I think you can.
Yes, you're audible.
So first, to perhaps recognize the level of knowledge and conversations from the speakers since 2 days ago. I'm Nirmala Gopal from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Just 2 points that I have, and one is that moves into the domain of academia to some extent. And recently we did a Scopus search using the word cybersecurity. And the data that the Scopus search threw out was that it showed us that developed countries, Western developed countries, were far ahead in terms of cybersecurity scientific research compared to developing, less developed, however we want to categorize the rest of the countries. And I'm wondering, well, and what the search showed us as well is that around the year 2012, we saw a huge peak in terms of the scientific research that developed countries are busy with. So I was wondering, would it not be useful, and perhaps something for us to consider, would it not be useful to put out a global survey to look at the levels of cyber risks that the various populace actually experience, both developed and developing countries, and then make comparisons and find out where our gaps really are. And then the second question I want to ask is, should cybersecurity sit predominantly in the domain of ICT, or should we spread it across the various domains, for example, law, social sciences, economics, etc.?
Sure, I think I'll get Ephraim to take the second part of the question, especially on cybersecurity. Should it be the domain of ICT, or you need to broad base that, and then whoever wants to answer the first half, yeah.
I think I can give a comment on both.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Regarding the survey question, if it's useful to come up with a survey, there's, I think, companies which do surveys, the only thing that they need to do is maybe help to publicize some of the data that they collect. There's a lot of companies which document internet shutdowns, document cyber attacks and others. It would be good for them to share the research with other researchers. That was my point about research, sharing the research with other people beyond just one company. And the issue of cybersecurity is being a domain of ICT or law or other, I think that's a philosophical argument. But I think practically we should not work in silos. There is, as I mentioned, when you bring a cybersecurity conversation to a parliamentarian in my country, maybe I shouldn't be talking about this because you're part of that court case, but in some countries such as Ethiopia or Tanzania, which other people have sued maybe the state for coming up with laws which are not about cybersecurity, they're about other issues. So they're not about the infrastructure, they're about content. So it's not a siloed, we should not approach it on a siloed approach, it should be a multi-stakeholder approach so that different people give different expertise.
Right. And the first part of the question, I think if anyone would like to further elaborate on that. Arun, yeah?
Yeah, I only to say that in any domain that is developing, there is a certain, for lack of a better word, hegemony that comes with who is driving the research, who has the money. So that, for instance, there are conversations today on the public core of the internet, right? It is essentially a conversation that has emanated from Western Europe and has come to the other parts of the world, but we don't really know what the public core of the internet mean. And there was a great panel discussion yesterday. Who underwrites the public core of the internet? What does the kind of risks, as you mentioned, in India and China and other parts of the world that are even less developed, are very different from the nature of risks. We are, of course, concerned about elections being manipulated, but there are bread and butter concerns of cybersecurity that dominate our conversations on a more daily basis. I think, given this limitation, I think it's still possible for us to create, especially in platforms like this, norms and narratives that reflect our concern. If you look at the climate debate, for instance, there are concepts like common but differentiated responsibilities that India, I think we can, as Indians and South Africans, we can be proud of having develop these concepts despite enormous opposition to the. So hopefully these things will happen in cybersecurity as well, and hopefully with people like you can contribute to them.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, we've got one there. Right.
Good morning, and thanks a lot for the discussion. I'm Sophie Gauthier from the French Embassy, posted in Delhi. So my question, I guess, is more directed to Kaja and to Gail. So beyond the coordinated work that your companies are undertaking to prevent and protect from cyber attacks, is there a reflection going on in Microsoft and Facebook on the premises on which digital world and digital companies are working, and which might be seen as vulnerabilities that attackers take advantage of? I'm thinking, for example, of the collection and use of data, which is at the core of your ecosystems and which attract attentions from attackers. I'm also thinking about the way information and opinion are shared in Facebook, for example, where you do have, profiles that you consult the most, which are mostly actually shown to you on a regular basis. You have like, dislike, way to tell your opinion, and we've seen yesterday with Russian panelists that was a tool used by attackers to also shut down profiles. So either a reflection going on beyond those technical vulnerabilities about the way companies work in this ecosystem. Thank you.
So
Yes, Gail.
just to, I'm not sure if I heard your question probably. Are we thinking about privacy as well as security, or what is the sort of the theoretical approach to?
Indeed, there's a link with privacy, and the question is the way you propose to interact on Facebook. Maybe it's more directed to Facebook than Microsoft, but also the use that you're doing of data to finance yourself. I mean, Facebook is free, but is using data for advertisement. So do you reflect on this? Because those data collection is targeted by attackers. The way information is shared, which is sometimes not so open, because you're actually confronted with same opinion as the one that you're consulting. So either any reflection in your model.
So I hope if I don't answer your question, because I'm not sure I've understood all of it, then please let's follow up afterwards. But in terms of our, so do we reflect on privacy and security? Those are the two things that drive every single decision that we make. So when we are making a change to any of our products, then those are the two things that we focus on. And they're also legally, when we mentioned GDPR and the Federal Trade Commission, those are legally issues that we have to concentrate on. And then again, coming back to trust, they're also ones that we know matter to users and matter to governments around the world. Yeah, so there is, however, it's often a difficult balancing act, providing a service that enables people to connect in a way that is truly effective, means that we're not gathering any data that we don't need to, and that we're not keeping any data that we don't need to, and then also making sure that we're getting the security absolutely right. And it's something that we are constantly working on and debating and working with academics and trying to make sure that we can get to exactly the right point. But I don't think it's like most things at Facebook, it's something that we will continue to work and will continue to evolve as the products change.
All right, I think we're really running out of time, but I can see there are more questions. Can I know how many more to go? So I think we have 3. If I can request all of you to go ahead with your questions, and then we'll see how best we can answer them in the limited time. Sir, please go ahead.
Thank you. Paul Cadera from the University of Toronto. The day before yesterday, there was a news story that motherboards of some computers had an extra little chip in them that had been inserted allegedly by somewhere in the manufacturing chain. Should the Tech Accord include hardware manufacturers and supply chain management? Because clearly, whether it's my computer or NSA's computer or the British Security Agency's computers, I want to make sure there's nothing there that's going to risk my data and indeed create a broader vulnerability for where I live.
Sure, important point there, but we'll go ahead with the next 2 questions. Yes, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I was going to actually raise that issue as well. Those chips were put on boards that came from manufacturers, subcontractors in China. So you have to ask the question of who's responsible, who's liable for that, which is a breach of trust that also directly impacts both the privacy and the security of users writ large, as well as the firms, the companies that depend on those products. So, if the Tech Accord's not the place to find relief for that harm, I'd like to know where is. At the same time, Facebook did raise a really important security feature that we all should take advantage of, which is multi-factor authentication. That's a way to establish accounts that don't just depend on your password, don't just depend on one thing in order to log in. Facebook rolled out this feature, which is fantastic,
Sure.
But admitted a couple weeks ago that when you provided your phone number as your second token to authenticate, those phone numbers within about 2 weeks, according to the press, started showing up on lists for targeted advertising. So this is a security feature that was rolled out in a way that directly conflicts with both security and privacy.
Sure.
So I'm wondering where we as users can go in order to rebuild the trust. If it's not the Tech Accord, where is it? Thanks.
Right, perfect. Last question there, and then we'll get our guests to answer.
Thank you very much. Janet Salem from the United Nations Environment Programme. Arun, you mentioned that when you have an international agreement like the Montreal Protocol, perhaps even the Paris Agreement, they can be very successful in driving change. But one of the things that really underpins them is the independent scientific body that can inform policymakers in a neutral way. That's the science policy interface. And then I was thinking back to when Mark Zuckerberg was brought to the Senate hearing, and a lot of people commented that the senators didn't seem to be, there seemed to be a bit of room for them to, they didn't seem to know how to ask the right questions. I don't know how to say it. But, so I'm wondering, when you talk about a tech accord, is there room for something like an independent scientific body, an international independent scientific body, that can bridge that gap between a lot of the experts and the policymakers that have to make these decisions? And related, is the academic community up to speed on what's going on in all the private companies? How much are they really fully aware and able to scientifically assess what's going on in a way that they can neutrally advise governments? Thank you.
Sure, sure. Very quickly, the hardware question, followed by the academic question.
So yes, we do have hardware companies that are part of the Tech Accord. So I think that's an easy question. I think also one of the principles, I feel it's the second one, but I'm not entirely sure over the top of my head, talks about the importance of securing supply chain security. I would say I feel he didn't introduce himself, I think it was a gentleman from Access Now, when you say where you go for relief, I would like to also point out that this was not necessarily a failure of, I think, not to speak for the companies, because I think companies that are mentioned in the article denied it quite vehemently. But in the article itself, it seems that the vulnerability was uncovered very quickly by the companies. I would also remind you of something that Gail sort of alluded to, which is, security is not like a one-off fix, and the Tech Accord doesn't mean there won't be security problems. It is an effort to improve security over time, rather than suddenly magically the solution will appear. So this is a long-term process and a long-term commitment. So I think with all of this, keep this in mind. I don't think the security challenges will go away anytime soon.
Sure.
Don't expect that from the Tech Accord or from the industry overall.
Right. And anybody for the last question? Anyone wants to take that, Arun or Brian?
I think on the having an independent body, absolutely yes. The Montreal Protocol, for instance, has an implementation committee which is comprised almost entirely of non-partisan experts, and never once has the Montreal Protocol Executive Committee, which is governments, ever turned down the advice of the implementation committee. So it just goes to show that scientific and academic expertise has a role to play. On the issue of the hardware and the chip I think governments are going to listen in whether we like it or not, and it would be really a tall order for us to try and regulate. I'm reminded of very quickly a story. A friend of mine who is now completing his dissertation, he's a former Israeli intelligence officer, and he's working on a dissertation on the law of espionage as it relates to cyberspace. So he told me that in the history of international law scholarship, there have been 3 books that have been written on espionage, whether it's digital espionage or not. And one of them is in French. So he is working on a sum total of 2 books on espionage, and lawyers are known to write on a subject that is clearly intractable. So I think the Tech Accord should be ambitious, but it should also be practical in what it can achieve.
Absolutely. I think those are great comments to close this discussion with. I would have loved to take closing comments from everyone, but we've clearly run out of time. I think the future will clearly be grim if we don't have companies acknowledging and accepting the kind of feedback and criticism that they are getting. The writing on the wall is very clear. There is no room absolutely for laxity on issues like privacy, on issues like security. So while we know that there are past mistakes, there are lessons to be learned, I think the Tech Accord in many ways is a huge step forward. It is an ambitious one. It is one that needs to be practical, but at the same time, at least a principled approach by large tech companies, a proactive approach by large tech companies to take on some of these issues head on. Thank you very much to all our panelists for a wonderful discussion, and of course to the very engaging audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shweta.